Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I am a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington. We are going to talk about subsidies today. The world is going through a wave of subsidies and industrial policies in a way we haven't seen for a very long time. Obviously, the pandemic and the need for recovery and support saw the birth of many subsidies domestically. Lately, we've also seen a surge in subsidies motivated by competition, national security, strategic autonomy, and of course, the urgent need to handle the climate crisis. China has subsidized its state-owned companies for a long time, but recently we have also seen the US investing in promoting batteries, semiconductors, and last year the adoption of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act to subsidize electric vehicles, green manufacturing, and the renewable energy. And this comes after a time when the US traditionally has been very critical to industrial policies. Also, the European Union has launched grand subsidy patterns in batteries, semiconductors, hydrogen, and is looking to find common investment in critical minerals. It is relaxing its state aid rules, and around the world, we see a same pattern in Japan, in Canada, etc. Of course, it can make sense to intervene when state subsidies when markets fail. And the commitment to fight climate change and the green transition is a unique challenge. But we also know from the past that subsidies can be very harmful. They can distort global trade and competition. So what is a good subsidy and what is a bad subsidy, and how can we tell? Well, and how can we stop the most harmful subsidies? Well, these are a few things we will discuss today, and I have two wonderful panelists to help me answer those questions. Anabel Gonzalez, former trade minister from Costa Rica, and now the Deputy Director General at WTO in Geneva. And Inu Manak, who is a researcher in political science and a fellow for trade policy at the Council of Foreign Relations in DC, Washington. You're both very welcome. So to start, what is actually a subsidy? Well, there's a lot of literature written about this, obviously, but you can say, to simplify, that a subsidy is a financial aid provided by a government to a producer or a seller of a goods or services that is designed to increase the competitiveness of a particular industry. And as I said, the US used to be very much against the use of subsidies globally. And I remember when I was EU Trade Commission, we actually sat the EU and the US together with Japan to try to see if we could rewrite and update global rules on subsidies. This was mainly targeted towards other countries, such as China, who used subsidies widely. Global Trade Alert is at the St. Gallen Institute in Geneva, and Professor Simon Evnett has mapped subsidies for decades. And even before the Inflation Reduction Act, he could see a sharp increase in subsidies, post-COVID, obviously, and recovery, but also others. And he claims that between 2008 and 2022, he could identify more than 18,000 subsidies only in China, the US, and the EU. So this is massive. You just wrote a paper about subsidies for the CFR. Help us understand, what exactly is the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, and why has the US shifted in its views on subsidies?
Great. Thank you, Cecilia. I appreciate the invitation to be here, and thank you to the Peterson Institute for organizing this webinar today. Pertinent question, obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to call it the IRA. I apologize to my European friends for calling it that. But this is the Biden administration's signature climate action. $307 billion of spending and tax credits to fight climate change and invest in low emission energy sources. The IRA is estimated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. It's a very broad-based spending package described by President Biden as the most significant investment ever to tackle the climate crisis. It includes a $14 billion investment in electric vehicles and batteries. A key aspect of that law is a tax credit of up to $7,500 for Americans that can receive a purchase when they purchase an electric vehicle. However, these tax credits are restricted to vehicles assembled in North America, including Mexico and Canada, where U.S. automakers have major operations. Congress has also required that an increasing percentage of EV battery components, including the critical minerals mostly now sourced from China, be supplied from North America as well, or from other countries with which the United States has an FTA, such as Chile. Though, of course, if you've been watching the news, you can also sign a trade executive agreement with the United States, which is not a free trade agreement, and still qualify for these benefits, as Japan has done and the EU is currently negotiating. Both of these restrictions have really riled up U.S. trading partners, obviously, that see these actions as blatant trade discrimination, which will only serve to reduce consumer choice and raise the cost of EV. But how did we get here? I mean, I think that's the big question. Why is the U.S. embracing this? The United States has generally preferred market-based measures to encourage economic activity, but industrial policy has made a comeback. I think we saw similar fears of foreign competition from Japan on semiconductors in the 1980s, which led to government efforts to strengthen U.S. industry. But debates of industrial policy go back all the way to the founding. We had Alexander Hamilton calling for the use of subsidies to support infant industries that provided for the essentials of national supply, including the means of subsistence, habitation, clothing, and defense. But this is in contrast to today, where industrial policy combines both subsidies and tariffs to address reliance on foreign supply. And I think this shift begins with Trump, whose tariff policy, defended at the time as helping the United States compete globally against a rising China, has been maintained and expanded upon by the Biden administration through the addition of major new subsidy programs, including the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. Now, the primary motivation for these two efforts: two buckets, I would say. The first is to counter a rising China, and the second is to fight climate change. And while these may seem somewhat divergent motivators, and I know you mentioned a couple of different motivators for industrial policy today, Cecilia, this is really interesting because the Biden administration has emphasized that its industrial policy is focused on one core idea, that strategic public investments are essential to achieving the full potential of the nation's economy. What that means, we have yet to see, because we've seen two instances of industrial policy so far with this administration, and we may see more, but that is to be seen.
Sorry, I had some problem with the microphone there. But of course, investing in environment like this is something very laudable. I think it has been applauded from different corners of the world. So that is not the problematic part. The problematic part is that so it creates incentives also for foreign companies to invest in the US in a way that has perceived as unfair. And with this, of course, the European Union, who has also been investing lately in different aspects, looking at how can we counteract it, so to minimize the side effects of the IRA. So do you think we risk entering into a subsidy war here with this? Because it has effects, even if the purpose is domestic politics, obviously, it has effects on the whole world, the US being such an important trading partner to many countries.
Absolutely. I think if you look at the IRA as currently structured, it's not WTO compatible. But the question is whether anyone will challenge it. And I don't think necessarily it would be wise to do so, given the reason that you mentioned, that this is a laudable action to take on climate change. And it's good the United States is doing something finally after so long of not doing enough. I think for many critics have basically said that the United States could always do more. I think that one of the challenges to putting a formal WTO dispute on this would be the fact that if you look at how the United States has recently reacted, for example, for disputes on steel and aluminum tariffs, we probably see something similar here. I think because the Biden administration sees the IRA as a matter of national security, which it deems as having no right to be judged by the WTO. So I think that would further hamper efforts to bring back dispute settlement. The bigger issue, I think, in all of this is the fact that the United States simply is not that interested in whether or not its actions are WTO compatible. I think that the fact that the IRA made it through Congress without changes to ensure that it was WTO compatible shows that both the executive branch and Congress are willing to ignore those rules to achieve their policy goals. In this case, what this means for U.S. trading partners is that if they cannot negotiate some of the benefits of the IRA bilaterally, they're simply going to respond by enacting similar policies of their own. And I think we've seen that happening already. The EU, for instance, is considering the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Minerals Act, which aim to reduce the EU's dependence on China and sets targets for domestic production as well. There's one objective to make 40% of the green tech needed to meet emissions targets within the bloc itself. So that's a pretty ambitious target. And furthermore, we've seen some countries like France banging the usual protectionist drum to push for anti-dumping and countervailing tariffs against Chinese electric vehicles. I think we're thus likely to see a mix in reaction to what the United States has done of increased subsidies and other trade restrictions as countries try to carve out their own slice of the green transition.
Annabelle, where you're sitting in the WTO, what is driving this new interest in industrial subsidies? Because it's not only a US phenomenon.
So first, thank you very much, Cecilia, for inviting me to TradeWinds. I'm delighted to be here with you and with Inu to discuss the topic of industrial policies and more specifically subsidies. So we are seeing, as you both have said, increased government efforts to shape the economy by targeting specific industries, specific firms or economic activities through subsidies and other tools. And also increasingly worrisome policy dynamics around them that are mounting trade and political tensions that can potentially come at a high cost. Now, to be sure, subsidies have long posed difficulties for global trade, but I would say that the problem is more acute and the need today and the need to address it is more urgent. And there are rising and pressing global challenges that have prompted renewed debates in many countries on whether market forces alone are enough to tackle some of those pressing issues, or on whether subsidies and other industrial tools or industrial policy tools are needed to more rapidly attain some of those goals. So you both referred to climate change, where given the likelihood of positive externalities from clean energy innovation and economies of scale, there may be a strong case for stepping up public investment as part of an ambitious green policy package to accelerate the transition to a net zero global economy. But there's also the digital transition, for example, and in the context of winner takes all digital markets and high scale economies, industry concentration, powerful network effects, there's a strong temptation to use subsidies as industrial policy to create, support, or protect national champions. Emergency support, of course, in the context of health and economic emergencies, governments use subsidies to protect individuals, households, and or jobs in the face of vulnerability and halting economic activity. Or we also see supply chain resilience and security, governments increasing activity in subsidizing the creation of alternative sources of supply and production for key inputs in response to shocks that have exposed the vulnerabilities of supply chains. And in the face of deepened geopolitical tensions, gaining a competitive edge in strategic industries is increasingly seen as critical to protect national security interests. And maybe let me just mention last but not least that state-owned enterprises and the role of the state. So with SOEs becoming more internationally active, there are many questions about the effects and international spillover of SOE-related subsidies and whether subsidies in other jurisdictions are an effective policy response to level the playing field. Now, the difficulty in addressing this topic is that there is a lot to unpack and that the economics of subsidies it's not black and white. Subsidies can be good or bad, or they can be good and bad at the same time, advancing legitimate policy objectives and creating positive spillovers alongside negative spillovers as well. Now, one thing is sure, I think, which is that even in the best of circumstances, subsidies do not come cheap or without consequences. At the domestic level, think about fiscal pressures and the diversion of resources from other pressing needs. From the perspective of global environment, think about the damage caused by fishery subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, and many agricultural subsidies. And from the view of other countries, think about the distortions on trade and investment, the erosion of existing trade commitments, and the sense of unfairness that comes from knowing that those with big pockets can tilt the competition in their favor. And that's not even considering the risk of rent-seeking and protectionism sneaking through the back door. So in my view, in this context, it's firms and governments will not just sit idle. Among those who can afford it, copycat behavior will ensue, igniting a global subsidy race. Those who can't may resort to other tools, for example, export controls on raw materials, nationalization of production, or forced domestic industrialization. And governments may also opt for measures to circumvent or to counter the effects of subsidies, risking lose-lose outcomes and potentially greater fragmentation. So in this context, the question is, of course, then what to do?
Yes, and as you said, we have seen this in the past. Of course, the climate crisis is huge and in a way new, but we have seen it in the past, and that's also what led member states, including the US, who was very pushy several decades ago to set up rules within the WTO system, agreements on subsidies and countervailing disciplines, which were there to sort of hinder that the potentially good subsidies hurt the others. These rules are still there. Of course, they probably need to be updated a little bit, but could they be used theoretically? Now, of course, the political will might not be there, but they are there, still there. They could also be used for subsidies in the climate area, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Cecilia. So let me start by saying that, to me, the starting point is that existing rules have overall served WTO members well for over 2.5 decades. So as part of the broader trade system, subsidized disciplines have underpinned decades of trade-led growth and prosperity around the world. And while they may need to be revisited, as you were suggesting, they provide a solid foundation. And we have the rules in the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, and we have rules in the Agreement on Agriculture, and we have, if you wish, less developed rules, but still something on the General Agreement on Trading Services, the GATS for services subsidies. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, I think it's important that we focus on the agreement on subsidies. And this agreement is, again, it basically defines a subsidy as a financial contribution by a government or public body or any form of income or price support that confers a benefit on the recipient. Now, to be subject to its disciplines, a subsidy must be specific to an enterprise, an industry, or a group of enterprise or industries. The agreement has two categories of specific subsidies: prohibited subsidies, which are basically those contingent on export performance or the use of domestic over imported goods, and they are irrebutably presumed to distort trade and thus can be subject to remedies, to countermeasures. There's another category, specific subsidies, called the actionable subsidies, where basically adverse trade effects must be demonstrated for remedies to apply. Now, before 1999, there were other types of subsidies that were called the non-actionable subsidies that included certain specific subsidies for research and development, for regional assistance, and for environmental adaptations that were presumed to be good subsidies, if you wish, and they were not actionable precisely because of this reason. Now, in the case of both prohibited and actionable subsidies, the remedies consist, members can obtain a remedy either going through the multilateral dispute settlement in the WTO or by applying countervailing duties in their own internal regimes. Now, in the face of the challenges that we were discussing before, national security or resilience or climate change or others, I think that there are several questions that arise. One is, do global subsidy rules need to be updated, strengthened, or rebalanced in the area of industrial subsidies? But also, I want to mention agriculture, where there are longstanding concerns about the adequacy of existing rules to rein in on highly distorted markets. Now, if so, is it feasible? Will divergent views or other obstacles stand in the way of reforming these rules? And third, of course, it's very important for us here at the WTO is how to go about it. And I'm happy to discuss more about these issues as we go on.
You know, what do you say? Could theoretically the current system be used to help distinguish between good and bad subsidies, and how would you go about?
Absolutely. I think there are several ways to do this. And Annabelle is absolutely right that the foundation is there and we have to build on it. And there's an opportunity to do so now. I think one thing we could do in trying to distinguish good from bad subsidies is actually borrow some lessons from the agreement on agriculture, mainly limiting financial support for trade distorting subsidies, so the amber box, ideally identifying a set of minimally trade distorting subsidies, a green box, and then also identifying a category of subsidies not subject to a cap on total spending, so a blue box of subsidies. I think that subsidies that would fall under a blue box category could include those that genuinely advance the goal of fighting climate change, secure access to food and water, and support global health, for example. These should be considered subsidies that support the global commons, not just individual country economic interests. And green box subsidies, on the other hand, could be more narrowly defined and include things such as research and development and disaster response. This would borrow from elements of the expired Article 8 provisions of the SCM agreement. Now, I think that the discussion of what should be included in the green and blue box categories can begin actually in the SCM committee. I think this committee is underutilized.
And that SCM committee means?
The Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Committee. Sorry, always among trade nerds, so I got to specify. But there are different things that the committees do. First, they address specific concerns that members might have, but they also have these broader thematic discussions about issues that members are concerned about. And I think that's the appropriate place for a broad-based discussion that's technical. And I think that's important that we have a technical discussion first before we raise it to a higher political level to understand what are countries doing that would fit within these potential boxes of different subsidies that we would be okay with. And I think part of that experience has to be members sharing their own subsidy policies where they have been able to efficiently use them to address specific goals to assist with developing a set of best practices that others can learn from and inform these discussions. So I do think that's one of the ways that we can retool this. And once we have these categories defined, members could agree to an overall cap on industrial subsidies, using an average for the total number of subsidies over a 3 to 5 year period, ensuring that wealthier countries would subsidize by a lower percentage than less developed, smaller countries. And I think that also when you think about what would be in that blue box of subsidies, that should require support for a fund that can be used to provide technical assistance, similar as we have in the fishery subsidies agreement, and also ensure some form of technology transfer to ensure that others aren't left behind in these investments, because ideally what we're going to have is a situation where only some countries are able to subsidize and others are not. So we need to create some guardrails within the agreement itself to ensure that we actually have the benefits spreading globally and not just locally.
And Annabelle, are these discussions taking place in the committees in Geneva, or could they?
Well, let me maybe start by saying that I think there are many, policymakers and commentators who have identified different problems with the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. And this agreement, problems mostly fall in the categories of the disciplines are too constraining, or they fall in the categories of the disciplines are not constraining enough. And, depending maybe on where you sit, or, depending on the subsidies that are provided for one particular government or other, or how they are impacted by the subsidies provided, by others, then you see things in different ways. So One thing that I would say is a priority for the WTO, and I can tell you that WTO members, of course, are very much on this sort of point right now, is that there is a need to have a deep discussion about the issue of subsidies and industrial policies, if you wish. The need, as I said, this has been a conflicting issue for a long time. And since 1999, when this provision on non-actionable subsidies expired in the Subsidies Code, there has been conversations on and off about the need of, reviving that article or not reviving the article, but looking into a list of subsidies that would be non-actionable, and this has been going on and off throughout time. More recently, I think, however, members understand first that there is a need to have more data and more evidence to know what's actually going on in the area of industrial subsidies. Because, if we think about subsidies in the area of agriculture, for example, or in the area of fossil fuel subsidies, we already have a lot of information there. The OECD, for instance, has been doing great work for a number of years, and we know how much money is spent on subsidies in each of these sectors. There's nothing comparable in the area of industrial subsidies. So the need for data and evidence is there. There's also a need for greater analysis because, as I was saying, the complexity of defining, whether subsidies are good or bad is not minor. Government support activities and firms in many different ways. They provide grants or benefits. They also make life more difficult, if you wish, sometimes for firms by establishing, taxes or regulations. So how do you go about all this? So greater analysis by policymakers, but also by academics. And I think this is something that I find of great importance here in the context of WTO discussions. And third, of course, greater deliberation and dialogue by members. And there are a number of proposals here on the table in the WTO, one by the European Union, but the African group has also presented another proposal and others as well. And I think the bottom line or common element across all these proposals is that members understand that they need to have this dialogue on these issues, look at the subsidies agreement in the context of the new realities, and determine, what's going on. Are the rules that we have right now good enough? Would they need to be reformed, rebalanced, and how to go about it? I think there is a sense here in Geneva that it may be too early to jump into reforming the agreement right now. But clearly, this is not something that can just, sit while all this activity is going on. And clearly, more data, more analysis, more discussion is needed with the view of determining, well, what kind of framework is required? Can we build on the existing framework? What reforms would be needed?
You mentioned the need to know what's happening, and you also, talked about transparency. And I know that WTO has recently, together with the IMF, the World Bank, and OECD, launched a sort of database or a common platform to try to bring greater transparency to subsidies worldwide. Can you tell us a little bit about this and what you hope to achieve?
Yes, Cecilia, this is a very important topic. So last year, the four organizations, the fund, the OECD, the bank, and us at the WTO, we launched a joint report on subsidies, trade, and international cooperation. And in that report, we highlighted the importance of better information, more extensive objective analysis, and regular dialogue to help governments assess how well current subsidy programs meet domestic policy objectives, at what cost, but also how they spill over international markets and how they interact with international policy goals. So that report was very well received. And as I said, one priority area was the need to have better information on subsidies. So as a first step, the 4 IOs decided to set up a joint online platform for subsidies data that provide links to existing data sources from each organization. And it can be accessed at www.subsidydata.org. And this portal, which we just launched a couple of weeks ago, provides a descriptive narrative that explains the different types of data available in the 4 IOs, the structure of the different databases, and detailed descriptions of their content and their underlying data collection methodology. From the perspective of the WTO, one objective that was very important to us was to make available WTO notifications of subsidies easily accessible and user-friendly, to move away from PDF formats into spreadsheets. And this is something that academics have been asking for a long time. So this, I think, shows the commitment of the 4 organizations to continue to work in this area. This was a first step. There is additional information that is very much available in each of these organizations that would need to be mined. For example, in the WTO, we have the trade policy reviews that are produced for WTO, for all of WTO membership. There's valuable information out there. So we want to be able to continue mining this information, putting it out there, and incentivizing researchers, academics. There's already great work being done, for instance, by the Global Trade Alert, by the University of St. Gallen, and others as well. We think that we are at a point right now in the trading system where, we need all hands on deck. We need all hands on deck to work on understanding what's going on, making the analysis, and then moving towards making proposals for reform.
What do you think, is this useful, or do we need this as well as more transparency within the WTO system, which of course depends on member states being willing to give that information? And it's happening so quickly right now. So probably one branch of the government doesn't know what the other one is doing.
Absolutely. I think it's an incredibly useful tool, and I was actually very excited to see it come online for the fact that for researchers, this is really helpful for us to understand what's going on, to make the linkages between data sets that the individual organizations have. So I think that this will generate a lot of research in the near future and coming years. I think that a lot of this can be complemented by the work the WTO does in the transparency space itself. And I think this is where the WTO has been a great leader among IOs. And I think that one of the
international organizations.
Yes, and I think one of the challenges the WTO has faced in the subsidy space is that the subsidy issue is a tricky one, where governments haven't always been as forthcoming in notifying their subsidies. They're not providing timely notifications or complete subsidy notifications. And I would say it's hard to solve the larger problem of subsidies if you don't know what's being subsidized, which is exactly why I think this database is very helpful, but also why we need to push a little bit to improve the notifications that come to the WTO. If you look at the recent report by the chair of the WTO Committee on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, it was noted that half of the WTO membership had not submitted their 2021 subsidy notifications by the mid-2021 deadline, while 65 members have not submitted notifications in more than 3 years. I think that this is just not good enough for what we need to be able to do, and having a discussion even about the state of play of subsidies and where we need to go. And that lack of transparency, I think, on the whole, makes members lose faith in the system a little bit. So I think strengthening those disciplines will be helpful. And I don't think we necessarily need to change the rules to do that, but there should be a way that we can build a compromise with members to say, hey, let's see what you're doing, and then let's talk about exactly where you may need more policy space, and then we can talk about that later in a more broad-based discussion. But we need to get that ball moving now, because subsidies are happening today. And so we need to be discussing those policies and understanding their implications and the consequences for the entire global trading system.
Well, the situation is rather urgent. First of all, of course, the climate crisis is urgent, but also the consequences if we don't do what you're both suggesting and others. I mean, what what effects will this have on the whole multilateral system? I mean, we risk creating even more cleavages between the global south and the global north, if I'm simplifying a little bit. And also, there's quite a lot of research showing that the effect of subsidies is maybe not as positive as estimated, and they don't necessarily lead to new innovation and productivity and so on. So the consequences of not doing anything must, of course, also be discussed. Here, research has I mean, there's already producing a lot of reports, and more will come, and this database will be helpful. But also that discussion has to take place also on a political level between member states, maybe starting at the technical in WTO, but at least taking it from there, because what dangers do you see for the whole multilateral system if this sort of goes out of control? I don't know who wants to start.
So let me maybe share some thoughts because, you know, I see, I say, 5 consequences of this non-cooperative behavior, and you know, I'm beginning to write something about this 5 C's as I see them. The first one is copycat conduct, and we are seeing this already. As soon as one country starts to do some things, other countries want to emulate that country. A second one is, I would say, competition, tit for tat competition, which is, well, you know, if a country grants a subsidy to attract an investment, then another country will grant another subsidy, and we have already seen that as well. A third one is countermeasures, you know, retaliation, and this can be, you know, this can become very, very nasty in international trade. A fourth consequence could be circumvention of retaliatory measures, or for example, if a country establishes a countervailing duty against a subsidy of another member, well, maybe you know, there will be ways of circumventing that. And the final C is, you know, all this leads to conflict, conflict with repercussions on global trade and investment, but also, and I think this is very important, on the attainment of the main objectives that the subsidies were aiming to achieve in the first place. For instance, if you think about, you know, some of the subsidies to support the net transition, some of the environmental subsidies, if these subsidies get you know, countervailed in another member and tariffs are raised on those products, then the transition to net zero economies becomes more costly. It may take more time. It may not reach all countries at the same, you know, with the speed that is desired. So at the end of the day, you know, this sort of tit for tat retaliation or countermeasures may really impact not only trade objectives that are very important, but also this other objectives, which is why the current landscape is very challenging. You know, if we look at subsidies and countervailing duty investigations at the WTO, they have been increasing steadily since 2010, and I fear that, you know, more will come. So this, in my view, is really sort of like a strong call for this serious conversation. And some conversations are happening bilaterally for sure. But I would also argue that, you know, at least certainly among the major players and maybe for others as well, this conversation about state intervention in the economy and how does this relate to trade, I think is very important. And, you know, I say it's important among the major players because, of course, those are the ones that have the biggest pockets to be able to subsidize. But then again, there's also concern on the part of developing countries. And in this context, a number of them are basically saying, well, you know, we want to make sure that we have certainty that some of the measures that we adopt, you know, will not be actionable in the system because developing countries also see subsidies as a tool for industrialization, for diversification, and for other purposes. So there are many things really going on here, and I think that, you know, this is sort of like a time to sit down, unpack all of the elements of this conversation, and begin to see, well, you know, what can we do about it?
Ino, do you have anything to add?
I agree with the 5 C's. I like that framework, Annabelle, and that's a catchy, good way to remember it. I would just emphasize the point that Annabelle made that subsidies distort trade and investment decisions, and that's one of the impacts that we will see in the trading system fairly immediately. I think this is why the EU has been so concerned about the IRA, that it would drive production to the United States as companies scramble to get a piece of the action. And in fact, if you look at the subsidies that are potentially going to be provided, they could support between 1/3 and 1/2 of the operating expenses of a battery plant. I don't think it's quite hard to see why companies may choose to invest in the United States because of that. That's a pretty strong incentive. And those incentives will adjust firm behavior. And I think that's something we have to be really concerned about, because if you look at the landscape of current subsidies, the United States, the European Union, and China are responsible for more than half of all international subsidy measures. And I think that raises the broader question about global equity and inclusiveness. Very few countries can afford to compete with these 3 markets, but even if these large markets compete with each other, I think that's going to leave everyone else worse off if they can't coordinate what they're doing to ensure that the benefits of those subsidies are broad-based. And I think that's where we have to start having a conversation to say, we all care about the goal of climate change. This is a global problem, and it requires a very global solution, not a local-based solution all the time. I mean, there are times we need local interventions, but we need to be really clear about what those interventions are, what is the failure we're trying to correct, and correct it in a way that does not harm others in the process.
There are lots of questions coming around this subject, and you both alluded also to other kinds of subsidies. Now we're mainly talking about industrial subsidies, but there are, of course, there's a question about many advanced economies now, if they want to talk about industrial policy mandates, but many developing countries would rather discuss agricultural subsidies. How can the WTO help navigate this potential issue? This is a well-known dilemma, right, Annabelle? Is there anything you can do to sort of lift the 2 groups together?
Well, from the perspective of economists, it doesn't really matter that much whether subsidies are in the area of industry or if they are in the area of agriculture. If they have this negative cross-border spillovers, it is important to address them. And of course, countries that have an economic structure that is more agricultural oriented, for these countries, this is a very important topic. So to me, looking at, and subsidies, they can go to many sectors. And, one thing that we've done recently here at the WTO is we negotiated an agreement to curb harmful fishery subsidies. And this is something that took a long time to negotiate, but these fishery subsidies, have been extremely detrimental to the oceans, to the livelihood of people, mostly poor people that depend on fisheries. So in the WTO, we already made progress in one important area in this. We're waiting for ratification, more to come, but I think it's a very important first step. But then, you can say, well, more to be done in the area of agriculture. There's a group of countries that also are having conversations on fossil fuel subsidies, another very important area. And yes, of course, we have this discussion that we've centered today on industrial subsidies. But depending on how, what are the advantages of different countries and how their economies, the economic structures come together, it is as important to address the shortcomings in the rules on industrial subsidies as it is to address the shortcomings in the rules on the agricultural area as well.
You want to add anything on this,
Yeah, sure. And just about thinking about what we could do, what the WTO could do, and what members can do throughout the organization to both better capture member priorities and then also strengthen remedies for violations. And I think that goes back to the point that Annabelle raised earlier, that there really are 2 concerns. Either the disciplines aren't strong enough, or the disciplines don't allow for enough flexibility. And I think we have to actually tackle both of these things at the same time. time, because I don't think they're necessarily contradictory, to be honest. And I think there's three ways we have to do that. The first is, as we've discussed, really clearly defining what is a good subsidy and what is a bad subsidy, and making sure we put very strict limits on those harmful subsidies. I think that is where you get more stringent disciplines, and you find a way to ensure that the bad subsidies aren't getting out of hand. So we need to have a clear way of doing that, but that comes from defining the good and the bad. The second thing is to really improve subsidy notifications and transparency. I think we need to develop some guidance on what should be notified as a subsidy, including what would fall under different categories of subsidies if we define them that way. We should have some sort of penalty for a failure to notify subsidies, to encourage members to submit their subsidy notifications in a timely fashion. I know that's somewhat controversial proposal, but I think it's something that we need to consider at this stage. I think that also when we think about what I've talked about, the blue box subsidies, we should think about ways that making sure that challenges to these subsidies would be prohibited for a certain period of time, say for a year, just to encourage the notification of these subsidies as well. And then also treating things that are non-notified as actionable, regardless of what category they fall into. And I think that's another way to discipline that notification process. But then going back to the violations and the remedies to strengthen the rules themselves, I think we have to consider permitting more immediate demands for compensation or retaliation for breaches of prohibited subsidies without waiting for the dispute settlement process to play out. I think members should not have to wait to undertake balancing in this space, because by the time the subsidy has gone into effect and you've shown the harm, it might already be too late for you to catch up. So I think we have to address that significant problem. And second, we should consider whether members should repay the value of those subsidies that are found to violate the rules. I think this reflects a similar approach to EU state aid rules, where members are required to pay back the entire amount of subsidies found to violate the rules. And I think we should be considering something similar to that. So I think the challenge, obviously, in the current environment, there's no institution that can really draw the line that this WTO has done until now. We have seen increasing CVD investigations, but there is less hope in the system overall. And I think that the Biden administration's suggestion that US allies should just drop their concerns with the administration's actions and emulate them could actually end up backfiring in the long run, leaving the United States with no recourse to address trade distorting subsidies. And the best place to do it is at the WTO. So I think this is where we should work to strengthen those rules and to make sure that other members abide by them and have buy-in on what these new rules are, so that they reflect the realities of today.
Well, that's a very convincing argument, but of course it all boils down to the political willingness of members to engage on this, and for this to happen, they also need to be aware of the negative consequences for every country, not only for the whole system. And as you said, of course, there is no dispute settlement mechanism that really functions today. So of course that difference between the WTO and the EU is a different animal in that kind. But the parallel is good. There are lots of questions on the dispute settlement mechanism. But
may I just come in for a moment, Cecilia, to say, because, it may appear that this is a daunting task, and I don't want to minimize it. I think it's very complicated. But as I said, we just saw members come to agreement in the area of fishery subsidies, and that's an important step. But we've also seen the development of these rules in other contexts as well. And, if you go to the USMCA, for example, there are state rules there on, for instance, on state-owned enterprises. That is something, of course, that is very much related to the issue that we are discussing here. Or if you go to the comprehensive CPTPP, for example, there are also rules in this area. And one very interesting is now in the freezer for other reasons, but the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China, there were also disciplines there in the area of subsidies. So this is not to say that, that governments have not thought about these issues. They have thought and they have acted in different contexts about these issues. Now, of course, we have a bit of reignited activity in this area, new drivers of this activity. But I think all this shows that again, members understand that subsidies may be used for a good purpose, but it's also true that they can distort trade and they can have a number of implications, and it's very important to have disciplines in this area. So even as it may seem daunting, I think that it is feasible and it's already happened either in sectors like fisheries or in other contexts like the ones that I mentioned.
Helping to identify the good, the bad, and the ugly in this regard. But you also mentioned this this initiative that WTO has taken with OECD and IMF and World Bank, and of course that involves a very large group of members, also on a political level, finance ministers and so on. And we know that it has been discussed in the G20 and G7, and sometimes there is a close interaction between G7 and G20 conclusions and then what lands in the different committees and in WTO. Now we are heading, they're 6 months away, we're heading towards a new ministerial conference in February in the United Arab Emirates. Do you think there's any realism in trying to do something up for the preparations until then?
So just before going there, let me just mention something, because I saw one question here and you made reference to it about, the issue of government coordination and other actors being relevant in the context of discussions on subsidies. And I think this is true. And I think, of course, trade ministers are very relevant in this conversation, but other government ministries are important. And I would probably highlight finance ministers, because of course they're the ones who hold the purse, and they are the ones who have to deal with the financial implications of these subsidies. So in my view, involving finance ministers in this conversation is something that is important. Of course, governments do it at the, internally, but it also probably makes sense to think about this kind of engagement at the, at the international level, so that, you can have trade and finance ministers discussing some of these issues, which would probably provide some kind of a holistic discussion on these topics. Now, coming back to our next ministerial conference, MC13, which, as you said, will take place in February in Abu Dhabi. I think that, well, certainly the issue of fishery subsidies will be on the table, because we will be looking at hopefully try to ratify the fishery subsidies that was agreed at agreement that was agreed at MC12. We'll be looking at strengthening implementation of developing, strengthening the capacity of developing countries' implementation of this agreement, and also looking at negotiating outstanding disciplines in this area. So I think fishery subsidies will be center stage at the next ministerial. As to these discussions on all this, very important topics on industrial subsidies, I think that there are a number of members that are looking at, establishing at MC13 a fora for conversation, be it a group or some other mechanism where, ministers will mandate their ambassadors here to begin conversations around these issues with a view of having a concrete outcome for the following ministerial. I think everyone understands that this is a complex topic, but that it's important to begin discussions. And MC13 may, if members agree, begin a process in this regard.
What do you say? Do you think there is any scope for progress either in this sort of WTO context, or also on other international forums where ministers naturally meet?
I do think there is scope for lots of progress, and I agree that on fisheries, we saw what was possible. And I think that's important to remember just what an achievement that was to get that agreement across the finish line and to finally create a new group of prohibited subsidies. So we can clearly see that members, when they have the right motivation to get things done, will actually deliver. And I think that at MC13, though we will not get a rewriting of the SCM agreement, I don't think that's going to happen in that amount of time, but we will have some discussions about what these problems are. And I think it's important that we're talking to each other because the absence of dialogue in itself would be a much greater problem. And so I think it is good that there are discussions happening. I think the bigger issue for me sitting in Washington is what's going on here in terms of the discussions on these issues. And I think that in Washington, we need to be really clear-eyed about what it is that we're trying to solve with subsidies. What is the problem? What's the market failure? And what tools are appropriate to address it? I think if we look at what the administration is doing, it's currently conflating its two main industrial policy goals, outcompeting China and fighting climate change. And I think that overall, this could undermine the effectiveness of climate action because as a major polluter, China needs to be part of that solution, not just painted as a problem, right? So I think this also risks alienating US trading partners that are not as hawkish on China and see a constructive role for China to play. So I think we should find a way to have a bigger discussion about how we can resolve some of our climate goals with participation from China as well. And I think the WTO is certainly one forum to do that because they're a member, and it's a place that I think we can have that discussion in a level that can address a varying amount of problems in a really technical way, but also allow for some political space to make some compromises.
But that also means addressing the question of the subsidies who are motivated more by national security reasons, and this is something we have heard in the past as well, long before the climate issues, and then it becomes really tricky because that needs to be put on the table as well. There was a question when you mentioned, Annabelle, that you were encouraging researchers and academia all over the world to come up with proposals and analysis to help reform the process and to put some new light into it. There's a question from a researcher asking if there is, by the four organization, is there a sort of a plan to promote some research field in this, or to set up an academic community?
Well, this is a great question, and I'm saying that the four organizations are considering organizing a conference on this topic and inviting, issuing a call for proposals for academics to reflect on this issue, present their papers, and share it more broadly with the academic community, but also with policymakers as well. So we hope that this will serve as an incentive for the academics, for researchers. INU has done fantastic work, for example, in this area. We hope that she and others will continue to think more about these issues, because these are complex issues. They go to the role of the state, what is it that states do in their own economies, and how their actions can have implications for others, sometimes even actions that are good, that are positive, but they have costs and they impinge on the others. How do you go about all of these issues? So as I said before, I think we need all hands on deck, and we're going to try to do that precisely starting with this idea of a conference on subsidies, on what we know and what we don't know about subsidies.
That's great news, and to all of you in the academic community or your friends who are, I hope you take this seriously, because obviously, we need ultimately political decisions, but they need to be fact-based and evidence-based. And right now, when things are happening so quickly, but also that we know that subsidies is not a new animal on the planet, we've seen it before, that we can merge all this together. Annabelle Gonzalez, Inu Manak, thank you so much for helping us to understand what is happening and what could happen and what should happen. And to all of you who listened or zoomed in, thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon, evening, or wherever you are. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia.